When it comes to the all-time most compelling storylines in American racing history, Micke Thompson versus the Indianapolis Motor Speedway ranks pretty high. After all, Thompson was the master of virtually all he saw during his high-octane life. A drag racing legend, a land speed racing American hero, an off-road racing titan, a speed parts magnate, a winner in all that he touched. Unless it involved a 2.5-mile round-cornered rectangle outside of Indianapolis. It was a place where an entrenched establishment rejected him, where catastrophe took a friend and a rising star from him, and where a man with the ambition of 15 men, the mind of an empirical genius, and an ego that dwarfed Indy's famous pagoda could let every wild idea he ever wanted to put into a race car come to life. And this may actually have been the problem. Before we get into the truly crazy race car that Thompson dreamt up for the 1967 Indianapolis 500, we have to really look at the hows and whys of Thompson's seemingly hideous record at the track. History gives us the benefit of perspective when we look back over stuff that happened in the past, and we can look back at media, interviews from the time, books that recorded the events, and magazines that were there. I'm actually of the opinion, after studying the subject for a while now, that Thompson, by virtue of staying true to himself and his own goals from his Indy beginning in 1962 through the last time he fielded a car in 1968, accomplished more than he's credited with. He was the only guy on the planet that was hard-headed enough, verbose enough, maybe crazy enough, and certainly audacious enough to not only pursue the ideas that he did, but to do so in a way that was so public and so loud that a mostly unknowing media and public couldn't help but be convinced that he was leading a technical revolution and that victory was imminent. Had Micke Thompson bought a Curtis Craft chassis or later a Lotus and an Offie engine or a dual overhead cam Ford, named the car the Micke Thompson Forged Piston Special, and just fell in line with everyone else at the Speedway, he likely would have been very competitive, to the point of likely having one of the best drivers, the best mechanics, and probably would have won multiple Indianapolis 500s. But here's the thing. Micke Thompson would have just as soon eat worms than do that. His sense of accomplishment was in designing and making new things, be they speed parts, the first slingshot dragster, the Challenger land speed car that carried him to 400 miles per hour at global fame, and, of course, his string of Indy cars. He brought 3 of them there in 1962, the first American entries with the engine behind the driver. This was the year after Jack Brabham showed the world what the future looked like in his little car. One carried an Indy rookie named Dan Gurney, and he qualified his car into the field of 33. The others missed the show. The next year, he was back with 3 cars. This time, they wore 12-inch diameter wheels with ultra-low profile tires for the era. People didn't know what to make of them. 2 of his cars finished, 9th and 23rd. The 12-inch wheels were made illegal by a rule change before the 1964 race that mandated a 15-inch minimum diameter wheel. It made his modified and rebodied cars sit higher. They drove worse. Dave McDonald was killed in one of them on the second lap of the 1964 race. Thompson, largely scorned by the establishment at the race, was pilloried both in public and private after it. And yet, he didn't quit. Not only did he not quit, but he seemingly got even more bold with his concepts and ideas. His 1965 Challenger Wheel Special was among the most oddly constructed cars in the history of the Indy 500. A massive titanium tube about a foot in diameter ran down the right side of the car, serving as both the fuel tank and the structural core of the chassis. Everything else was built off of it. The engine was a one-off small block Chevy with custom dual overhead camshaft heads, the entire engine canted way over on its left side to keep the aerodynamic profile of the car correct. Constant engine issues plagued this automobile. Burned pistons were a constant, and through a slew of problems, the car failed to qualify for the 1965 race. After skipping 1966, we now get to 1967. And before we get to the Wynn Spitfire Special, we have to mention one other point about Micke Thompson and his track record at the Indy 500. Drivers. There are many reasons why there was a very long period of stagnation at the Indy 500, but one of the most overlooked was right there in the cockpit. See, in order to actually win the 500, you needed a good driver, and good drivers needed good equipment. Good drivers did not go looking kindly on new technology, long shots, unproven cars, designs, and the list goes on. So naturally, this had an interesting effect on both the race and on Micke Thompson. It definitely drove the race toward cookie-cutter status cars and the ones they had for so many years in the roadsters. A Curtis Craft, an Offie, and a guy brave enough to hold the gas pedal down the whole way around kind of got you a fighting chance to win. It also meant that the small number of guys willing to work as test pilots on new cars, weird cars, or different cars was very small, and worse than that, either not so talented or wantonly reckless. Occasionally, Thompson lucked out with a guy like Gurney, an unknown who was not going to stay that way for long, but a guy who needed a seat. But for Micke Thompson, he was mostly relegated to helping get young guys a break or picking up from the few guys willing to climb into his cars, especially after the 1964 Dave McDonald disaster. I'm not here making excuses for Micke Thompson at the Indy 500, but I am here shedding some light onto the whole picture and allowing you to make your own judgments. It was a miracle he was showing up with this stuff that, kind of ran, taking on a global automotive superpower and multiple ones at that, and far more wealthy owners from what was really truly a peanuts budget that he was bringing with him. There was only one area that Micke Thompson never lost at an Indy 500, and that was in the media. They ate out of the palm of his hand, and he had plenty to feed them. He did not come across like a normal car owner or crew chief. He was constantly covered in oil and grease, thrashing on his car with the men in the garage. He cut a dashing and heroic hot-rodding figure, and the media lapped it up. After all, he was the first American to ever go 400 miles per hour, and that still in the mid-60s carried a very large aura with it. After taking 1966 off from Indy, but not from planning for Indy, Micke Thompson announced on January 24, 1967, that he was bringing 2 new cars to the Indy 500, and one of them would be packed with so much technology and heretic-level ideas, the world had effectively never seen anything like it at the Speedway. As it turns out, he was right, and likely for a reason. Like any good promoter, Thompson knew that playing the long game with the media was the far smarter move. You gave them a little at a time and kept them coming back for more. So the release in January was simple. It stated he was bringing 2 cars and power would be coming from stock block-style Chevrolets measuring 305 cubic inches apiece because that was the maximum allowed for the rule set of Indy that year for a stock block-style engine. The Associated Press covered this story, and as it would turn out, they'd cover almost every word out of Micke Thompson's mouth on this entire adventure. As history would show, Micke Thompson was already way ahead of the game when it came to the promotional side of things because about 2 weeks later, newspapermen and magazine writers from across California and the country were invited to show up to St. Gabriel Speedway to see the unveiling of the most radical of his 2 new cars, a machine that was to be known as the Wynn's Spitfire Special. They were introduced to the most wild conglomeration of ideas ever assembled in one car for the Indy 500 by both Micke Thompson and his sponsor Wynn's. The timing was perfectly strategic. The newspaper stories would hit the next day and through the coming weeks, but the magazines, which operated with a 3-month lead time, would be publishing their May issues with an Indy 500 preview story in them, and he figured he would be in every one of those magazines. And guess what? He was right. This car was literally everywhere, and for good reason. This was a front-wheel drive, front-engine car for starters. These were 2 concepts that were very well dead at the Speedway. The engine was an aluminum block 305 cubic inch Chevy small block with custom 3-valve per cylinder heads developed by Thompson himself. The engine was offset to the left of the car. The driver sat all the way back nearly between the rear tires, almost like a slingshot dragster. Lastly, the car had a feature which no car in Indy 500 history had ever sported at this point: 4-wheel steering. Of honorable mention in the weird department was the fact that the car's nose extended multiple feet ahead of the front tires, and there was a radiator mounted in an almost horizontal position inside of it. Finishing off this Sunday of crazy was the announcement that the car would be driven by Gary Congdon, a young pilot who had made one Indy 500 start the previous year and wrecked his car about a football field's length after crossing the starting line under the green flag on the first lap. What could possibly go wrong? We're going to examine this car in more detail as we follow it in the not-too-shockingly ill-fated path to the Speedway and beyond, but safe it to say, this thing seemingly combined every passé concept at the Speedway and threw a couple of more fresh ones in there for good measure along the way. Personally, I love the way it looks. Many newspaper stories mention throughout its short life that it seemed to be inspired by or appears to be a version of a dragster, and frankly, I kind of dig it. So let's get down to business. Micke Thompson did not scratch build this car. Joe Huffaker did. He was the famed builder that created the machine to the specifications Micke came up with. It's pure Micke in design and execution, but the hands of Huffaker actually did the job of bringing Micke's drawings and weird ideas and in-the-moment concepts and disruptive thinking to life. Very few images exist of this car with no body on it. It's a monocoque-style construction car that weighed 1,385 pounds with no driver or fuel and 1,995 pounds with both a driver and fuel. It carried a 96-inch wheelbase with a front track width of 59 inches and a rear track width of 56 inches. The car was 19 inches tall at the nose, 29 inches tall at the cowl, and 38 inches tall at the top of the driver's headrest. Four-wheel Earhart brakes were at the corners. 16-inch Genie magnesium wheels carried Goodyear tires at 45 psi. The odd for Indy 500 standards roll bar was made of 1.5-inch chromoly tubing, and the rear steering system was adjustable for varying levels of angle in relation to the front wheels. The thought here was to make it adjustable because no one really knew what the ideal rear steering angle would be at the Speedway because, well, no one had ever dared try it before. Thompson claimed in the release of the new car that he had secretly tried rear steering in one of his 1963 entries but had never told anyone about it. He was convinced that the rear steering would reduce the slip angle of the car, allowing it to carry far more speed out of the corners, reduce tire wear, and it would result in some dramatic increases in speed during qualifying in the race, and my God, he sold the concept well. If Thompson's former Indy entries had one thing in common, it was the fact that the world knew he'd be showing up with horsepower. After all, as a guy who made his living as a magnate in the speed parts universe, Micke Thompson knew how to make horsepower. Eschewing the off-the engine, not giving the dominating dual overhead cam Ford a second thought, Thompson went ham, and he decided to cast his own aluminum blocks, create his own 3-valve cylinder heads, and equip these cars with one of the most heartily interesting versions of the Chevy small block ever made. Looking at the engine, I know the first thing you thought of was, what's so interesting about a dual overhead cam small block Chevy? But that's the thing. This is not a dual overhead cam small block Chevy. This car used one camshaft in the block to operate all those valves. Don't worry, there will be a much greater look inside the engine here shortly. Now, as I previously mentioned, Micke may have never won the Indy 500, but he dominated the Indy 500 media, and this car was no exception. The machine's unveiling was carried in hundreds upon hundreds of newspapers nationwide, and it was a bonanza for wins and exactly what they were paying Thompson for. Exactly a month later, Thompson would once again make national headlines, but this was not for the car. It was for basically being a human superhero. While working in his shop on one of these two cars, he noticed some oil lines attached to a tank slithering out the door. He ran outside just in time to see a thief jump in a car and speed off. Thompson, who had the temperament of a stick of dynamite in situations like this, jumped in his own car, and the chase was on, literally. Thompson was witnessed going 80 to 100 miles per hour on city streets in Long Beach to catch the guy with his parts. Seen by Patrolman Stuart Gordon and Officer William Jonke, they joined the fun as well. Losing sight of Thompson and his quarry, they soon found the pair in a nearby alley, and Frederick Thomas Collier, then 26 years old, was described as being, quote, on the ground, end quote, and Thompson was holding his oil tank. Fred Collier had picked the wrong guy to steal from, and I'm assuming Fred Collier didn't sit himself on the ground. I'm assuming Micke Thompson's fist probably did. Now, unfortunately, that would be the last victory Micke Thompson scored around this car for a while, maybe ever. 10 days after this story was reported, the race car made the papers again, and it was bad. During a test session at Phoenix Raceway, the Wynn Spitfire plowed into the wall after a bolt fell out of the steering. It wasn't specified if it came out of the front or rear steering linkage, but either way it fell out, and it was a mess. The driver was okay, but the driver was not Gary Congdon. Sammy Sessions was reported as the driver at the time of the crash, and as we'll see, he ended up being the guy assigned to drive this car while Congdon took the seat of the second Thompson entry, which was a more traditional rear-engine car that used the same wild 3-valve engine as the four-wheel steering car, but none of the other doodads aside from, well, a suspension system that employed cone-shaped rubber springs instead of coil springs because, I don't know, why not? Well, Sessions was unhurt. The Spitfire was heavily damaged, and it was late in the game, so it left the racetrack and headed straight to the shop of Joe Huffaker to be repaired. That shop was all the way up in San Francisco. Of course, the problem here was that the team, the car, and the engines all needed to be at the Speedway in just a matter of weeks. It's important to remember, as it is with all things Micke Thompson, as all this chaos was going on, he was still running one of the most famous drag strips in the country. His Speeds Parts business was still generating millions of dollars of revenue from a load of different part numbers, and his burgeoning tire business had just started, and he had those other ventures he was involved in, which are too numerous to mention. Back in the headlines in April, Thompson declared himself crazy for trying to take on the Ford Motor Company single-handedly in the engine department, and frankly, by the way he was choosing to do it, he kind of was. For the engine enthusiasts out there, now's your time to lean in, because we're going to take a look at the 500-plus horsepower, 304.5 cubic inch unit that Micke Thompson created out of thin air to power this car, and unfortunately, it ultimately powered its undoing. Hot Rod Magazine put this engine on the cover of the June 1967 issue. Thompson had his own blocks cast privately out of 356 T6 aluminum. Now, there's no mention about who made them, but with the relationship he had with Reynolds Aluminum, we have to guess they were somehow involved. Thompson had final say on the decisions regarding the engine's design, but Bill Roshikoski, who was the project engineer and went by Rosie for obvious reasons, called the shots on a day-to-day basis and had to get approvals from Micke. Now, Roshikoski was the man in charge of development for all the engine parts and pieces. He was charged with assembly and dyno testing as well. Jim Ward and Jerry Norick were the engine builders that worked for Rosie, and they had their hands on this beastly creation, making sure all the building and assembly was done properly. Moldex was contracted for the billet crankshafts. The cranks used 2.45-inch main bearing journals like a 350 Chevy and 2.2-inch rod journals like a 427 Chevy. Supposedly, stock iron blocks were tried at first, but the bottom ends fractured out of them, which caused the need for the aluminum blocks and a beefier design. Henry's Machine Shop in Bellflower, California, machined the blocks for steel sleeves, aligned bored the cam and crank centers, drilled all the oil, water, and bolt holes, as well as making sure all the passages were clear and correct. Now, things got really serious from this point forward. Already known as one of the premier connecting rod manufacturers in the country, Thompson wasn't willing to chance aluminum rods in an engine that needed this much endurance, so he went a step further. Titanium. This was wildly advanced stuff for the time. It had to be insanely expensive to do this back in the 1960s as well. Now, the pistons were also one-off forgings, as the heads had a wildly interesting kind of pent roof or even close to a Hemi design. It kind of split the difference. Creating new dies and all the tooling to make these was no small task either, and many versions of the pistons were made with different ringland designs for testing. And now for the heads. And this is where the real magic was happening, and actually it was more voodoo than magic, but you'll get the picture here shortly. Rudy Moeller, who was an amazing draftsman and expert-level guy in the casting world, was integral in drawing these heads up so they could actually be made. His career in the high-performance world stretched back to the 1920s, working with the Chevrolet brothers, and he worked for many years in the aviation industry, so this is a project right in his wheelhouse. Using 2 intake valves and 1 exhaust valve, 2 versions of the head were made, an 8-port version to be used on the Spitfire car, and a 16-port version to be used on the second car, the more normal, but not quite that normal, machine known as the Wynn's Challenger. The valve angle was 45 degrees on all the valves, and all were custom-made in stainless steel. Actuating those valves was the truly incredible part of this engine. Now, because Micke wanted to stay with a single cam and block design, things had to get weird somewhere, and they got weird in the valve train. Crowder and Winfield both made varying camshaft designs for the engine. Crowder also manufactured special needle-bearing roller lifters to kind of start this whole valve train parts process moving. Then the 2 intake valves are opened by a single Smith Brothers pushrod per cylinder, and this was done with a specialized rocker arm with an offset position for the pushrod to work, and a second nose opened both of the valves with a single rod, making it happen. This is relatively easy to visualize, as it basically just looked like 2 rocker arms stuck together being actuated by a single pushrod. The exhaust side of this cylinder head, though, in the valve train anyway, is science fiction. Because the exhaust valve was effectively on the other side of the massive cylinder head, it was an actual daisy chain of craziness. Multiple rocker arms were used, there was a bell crank in there, and I'm going to walk you through this, and hopefully you can put your visualization mind to work, and I'll show you the photos that I've been able to glean of this setup. Now, for starters, the exhaust pushrod was in the same position it would have been in a traditional small block Chevy, right next to the intake pushrod. What would happen next is multiple rocker arms would be used in this process. Now, one of those rocker arms was in the traditional position next to the intake rocker on the same shaft. That arm would actuate a transverse pushrod that basically ran across the head and then operated a bell crank that would open the exhaust valve. Now, it's miraculous that this engine worked at idle, let alone on a racetrack. The whole thing is pretty difficult to visualize, and frankly, there's not a ton of good period photography to really lay it out, but it's just amazing. And when you think about how it worked, and again, you have to look at the engine and see the twin rocker covers. Just know that there is a pushrod not only coming up off of the camshaft on the intake or inner side of the head, but one that is also running basically straight across to the outer side or the exhaust side of the head, and that is operating another arm to open that valve and let the exhaust out. Yeah. Crowder and Winfield, as mentioned, provided a bunch of different cam grinds for testing and power-making purposes. The cam was gear-driven off the crank. The engine had a custom front cover that held a bunch of stuff, including the gear drive for the magneto, the water and fuel pumps, and fuel injection was through freshly made Hilborn injector bodies and Hilborn fuel distribution parts. But instead of going full Hilborn with all his parts, a British-made Teclamet Jackson injection system was being favored by Thompson after early dyno testing. Now, at the close of the hot rod piece about the engine, they mentioned that the magazine would be out before the race. Now, I know it was the July issue, but it arrived in homes early, as magazines always did. And they hoped the engine would help Micke make the show. Little did they know at the time, when they made this story, that the engines almost didn't even make it to the racetrack. Micke Thompson had an engine problem that even he and all of his knowledge, power, and superhuman might could and would not fix. His aluminum engine blocks were more like aluminum sponges. They were so porous that they didn't just leak oil, they wept it, and from virtually everywhere. On May 2nd, 1967, the car arrived at the Speedway to much fanfare. It was received with excitement on the same day that the world got a look at a new rear-engine car made by Clint Bronner and Jim McGee as well. Bronner's car went out and cruised around at 163 miles per hour in practice with Mario Andretti at the wheel. Thompson's car didn't even have an engine in it, nor was the engine even in the same state. Micke, for the first time, mentioning to reporters of a, quote, little porosity problem, end quote, with the blocks that he said he was working to fix. He also said that the engine was now making 560 horsepower and capable of revving to 8,000 RPM. This was a quantum leap from the 6,000 RPM it had stumbled through in early dyno testing, and at 560 horsepower, it was making more power than the mighty Ford dual-overhead cam engine. When the engines arrived a couple of days later, they were installed in both cars. Gary Condon took the four-wheel steering car out for its first practice. Gaining speed into turn 3, a front wheel fell off and he went skidding, thankfully without harm to himself or the car. A rather auspicious start, indeed. After the better part of 10 days of testing, both cars with Sessions and Congdon in their respective seats, Sessions in the four-wheel steering unit and Congdon in the rubber suspension rear-wheel drive car, Thompson's tone in the media began to change, and not for the better. He was openly combative, talking about battling the establishment, talking about the Wynn's program being a multi-year deal, with 1967 simply being a shakedown effort, and 1968 being the year they could really make some noise. He was also openly declaring that 1968 would be the last time he'd race the Indy 500 in any capacity, no matter the result. It wasn't going well. It wasn't that both cars were slightly off pace. They were both too slow to even make official qualifying attempts. The engines ate oil, ate pistons, and seemingly ate the hopes and dreams of every guy in the crew every time they tried to lean on them. Sessions described the four-wheel steering car as being, quote, spooky. Congdon could not coax enough speed out of the rear engine car, whether it was the finicky engine or the rubber suspension. It just wasn't working, and they were not close. On May 18th, Congdon did something pretty wild. It was the final day of qualifying for the race, and he was as desperate as anyone to find a shot into the show. He abandoned the Thompson car and drove a total of 7 different machines in one day. He was simply trying to find something, anything, to get a spot among the starting 33. He drove supercharged Offie cars, a turbocharged Offie car, and of course the Thompson V8s, among others. All for naught. Al Miller qualified 33rd with a speed of 162.602 miles per hour. Now, some media claim that one of Micke Thompson's cars missed the field by 0.2 miles per hour and the other by 0.7 miles per hour, but the official record of the race shows that neither car actually completed a full qualifying attempt. This indicates that they were either waved off for being too slow, or the drivers pulled in with maladies before they were able to post an official time. An Associated Press story on the 20th of May that was carried around the country sheds more light onto the troubles that the Thompson crew was having regarding the engines. The story claims that the teams had gone through 6 of the engines, which is likely more accurately stated that they have had to go through the engines 6 times. If the engines were consuming oil and leaking it profusely, as to all the reports which seem to indicate that, there is a chance they were also suffering from serious detonation issues which would kill pistons at a high rate. Oil in a cylinder when an engine is running at full song, or trying to be running at full song, is disastrous to both longevity and performance. The presence of oil in an engine like that causes pre-ignition or detonation or spark knock, however you want to say it, and it will wreck everything in its path, especially at high RPM. Now, the claim is that Thompson had $300,000 tied up into these 2 cars, and how much of that was Wynn's money is left to be speculated, but safe it to say, he had a lot of personal dough in these things. Thompson reiterates what he had already said regarding his Indy 500 future, and that 1968 would be it for him, win, lose, or draw. It also mentions that the engines were being run in the dyno all the way until May 11th before being sent express to Indy. That seems like a bit of a tall tale and does contradict the earlier month timeline in some of the newspapers, but again, it makes for a good Micke Thompson story. Proving once again that he was the master of the media at that time, days after the car's fate was decided as a non-qualifier, a story appeared in the papers about Larry Burton, who Thompson called the chief mechanic on the car. What made this story so compelling was that Burton, once a prospective racing driver, had been stricken with polio at the age of 20 and lost the use of his legs. He serviced the whole car from his wheelchair to the point that Thompson claimed he had stripped it bare to the chassis and rebuilt it all himself. On May 25th of 1967, the LA Times reported on the car's failure to qualify and the fact they had never registered an official qualifying attempt. Thompson affirms that he'd be back the next year and that it was a 2-year effort. He laments in the story that if GM were actually involved in racing, perhaps they could have gotten his blocks made and he could have gotten the blocks through GM, and this porosity issue would have been solved and it would not have stymied his team. The story ends with a line, quote, "He couldn't, and it wasn't," end quote. By May 28th, the story of the Wynn Spitfire and the rubber-suspended Challenger were off the pages of America's newspapers and sent into the bin of history. Except it wasn't. The Wynn Spitfire had more work to do, and that work was done at Bonneville. In October of 1967, a team headed up by Smokey Yunick went to Bonneville to break production car speed records on a massive circle of some 10 miles around. Thompson, Curtis Turner, and Bunky Blackburn were the drivers, and they wiped out a couple of hundred production car speed records. Now, it's a couple of hundred records because they kept counting the records they were breaking when they would break them again and again, but it made for good headlines. Otherwise, there was another big story here. Well, it wasn't that big a story, but in the terms of this story, it kind of is because, you know what else was there? A canopy-equipped version of the Wynn Spitfire. I asked Danny Thompson about this, and he said the car was going to be run around the same course, but you guessed it, the engine failed to cooperate, spit the bit very early in the action. But the Spitfire was at Bonneville, was equipped with a canopy, and was planned on being run to set some speed records, but it couldn't even pull that off. In 1968, Thompson returned to the Speedway, but without wins on the side of the car and without the Spitfire. Instead, the Wynn's Challenger was renamed the City of Long Beach Special, and he intended to have Danny Ongais as a driver. The Speedway officials rejected Ongais on the basis of lack of experience, and so he found Bill Puterbaugh to take the wheel. Now, despite mighty effort, the results were a nightmare. Puterbaugh was nowhere close to qualifying, spun the car in harrowing fashion twice, and decided enough was enough, walking away from the Thompson entry and attempting to qualify in other cars. This time, the engine was not to blame. How do we know? Thompson had gone to an iron block. The proof of this came many years later when the engine was disassembled and the City of Long Beach Special was restored at 955 Automotive in Pennsylvania. Having never been taken apart, these images show an iron production cast small block Chevy in use. Jason Orr of 955 Automotive in Pennsylvania that did the work said it was evident that the engine had been, quote, scabbed together with existing parts, as there were things that clearly mismatched each other and were used to get the engine in running order in what looked to be a pinch. And it was clear to Jason that the engine had never been taken apart after the 1968 race. Now, this also explains why only one car went back in 1968. Having ravaged the engine on the Salt in late 1967, Micke only had enough parts to make one complete engine and have some spares and backups to take with him. It also helps to explain why there were mismatched parts in the engine, according to Orr. They were down to whatever was left, and so they made it work at the time. So that's where it ends, right? Wrong. These images from Thompson's triumphant return to Bonneville in 1968 with a trio of young, kind of pre-production 1969 Mustangs show the Spitfire, now powered by a Ford wedge engine on the Salt. Thompson, who is now aligned with Ford, destroyed many of the records they had set with the Camaros in late of '67, and he was planning on blasting the existing land speed record to pieces with his Challenger 2 Streamliner using Ford power, and was in the process of building two of the most innovative and dominating funny cars the sport of drag racing would ever see. The blue car, driven by Danny Ongais, was virtually unbeatable in the 1969 season. So how did the reworked Spitfire car do at Bonneville with traditional Ford power? Unfortunately, there is no record of it that I can find, and the only existing thing I can find are these photos to show it even existed at all, so the answer is it likely didn't do all that well. Remember, front-wheel drive, total weirdness, even not great on the Salt. So from there, the story actually ends. There's no real record of what became of the car after its trip to the Salt, which has to be in the 1968 season because of the Ford engine and logos on it. The City of Long Beach Special was restored as mentioned and has been shown at places like Pebble Beach. And yes, the 3-valve Chevy engine runs and screams as you'd hope because of the awesome work done by 955 Automotive. So we're left with one last question to confront. Is the legacy of Micke Thompson at the Indy 500 one of abject failure? The tragedy of Dave McDonald's death is impossible to look past, and it haunted Thompson until his last day. While I can't say that I have the perspective that his legacy is one of success, it can be argued that his efforts, which always paled in budget, time, and outright scope as compared to those of successful owners and racers, were part of the forces of change at the fabled racetrack in Indianapolis. The tire innovation alone was game-changing. Thompson was a disruptive force in the history of the Indy 500, and that can't be denied. He was the favorite of hot rodders the nation over. He was also, despite the lack of outright success, a massive curiosity and publicity driver for the Indy 500 in the 1960s. Like the designs of his cars, the answer to the question is complicated. How do you answer it? I'm Brian Lones. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more explorations into racing machines, racing minds, and the history that binds them all together. See you next time.